Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending what time you're watching this video. This is the last video for the term for ethics in society. This is an overview of the final exam, which sounds very daunting when in fact, actually it isn't. It's actually fairly short. It's in two parts. The first part is the identify and explain section. And there, as we did with the midterm, you have a group of different terms, as I think about 12 or 13 of them. Answer only 5. And these are terms that we have used all through the course and certainly in the second half as well. So they're fairly straightforward and really shouldn't be that difficult to answer because they're only really worth 2 marks each. And in the other section are the short answer questions. And short answer, again, is a key idea because they're each worth 3. The main reason why this final exam is fairly short is because you've been writing quizzes all the way through or completing quizzes all through this course. So you should be pretty familiar with the material. And just in case you weren't sure where the material can be found, click on this right here. You should be able to see this. You go to evaluations and then quizzes. Scroll down here, and there is the online final test. And it's open until April 16th. So not this coming Sunday, but the Sunday after. So there's plenty of time, but there's certainly no harm in thinking about the material that could be on it. So let's close this up again and go to the other share screen, which is kind of the more important one, which is a review of the actual material. Here we go. So let's put this on here from the beginning, move all these other things out of the way. So this is a final exam review for weeks 8 to 13, or the second half of the course. So we started off looking at social contract theory. I'm going to move this over here. Okay, that's better. And we started with Thomas Hobbes, who really was a very much a kind of a negative view, pessimistic view of society. But he did think that self-preservation caused human beings to leave their state of nature and come together to form a contract, a special contract, a social contract, a compact. Any number of names really amounts to the same thing, which is a way in which people can get over their kind of individualistic nature and try to find something that that renders them, common with one another. And sure enough, Hobbes found that although we are individualistic in nature, we also are really afraid of people killing us or stealing our stuff. So the foundation of the social contract is this idea of a natural right that all individuals seek to protect their life and property. So fairly straightforward in that sense. And okay, how come we're not moving? Okay, try that again. Here we go. So the first fundamental concept is the fact that people wish to protect themselves, their loved ones, their stuff. And for that reason alone, they will come together and enjoy the benefits of this social contract. And this is in comparison to the state of nature where, sure, individuals have a right to all things, but that really means a right to no thing or nothing, because we all can sort of fight over it, and it becomes a war of all against all. So as much as we have absolute freedom, we really have no way of protecting that which we manage to either covet from someone else or find, on our own. So no matter what happens, we really have no way to protect ourselves. And that's where the social contract comes in. We're able to get that protection by giving up the ability to fight against others and say, look, we need to resolve our differences or our issues with a third party. Now, for Hobbes, that was the monarchy. For Locke and Rousseau, it was society and its laws. And so that is really what is the motivator for all of the social contract theories. They may look a little bit different on the surface, but underlying them is this notion that we have a right to certain things, not everything, but certainly peace of mind and protection and safety is paramount with all of them. So the fundamental law of nature, as we see, is that peace is to be sought as much as possible, and we do that by coming together, giving that protection, that ability to seek vengeance on others to a third party, and we now adhere to the laws that are part of that third party, that society, that community, that culture, however you want to describe it, that community has a set of laws that we all have to follow. Now, one of the most serious issues regarding the social contract is the notion of capital punishment, because it is very much a one-way street. This is more concerned with the fact that we may occasionally break laws, intentionally or not, but the very serious ones need to be dealt with. And they need to be dealt with in terms of not only punishing those people because these are serious crimes, I should say, but they should also be done publicly. And of course, at the time Hobbes and Locke and the rest of the social contract theorists are writing, capital punishment and public executions were exactly that. They were done in public. And it's really done to scare people into behaving. Now, that's kind of the 1600s and 1700s, a couple hundred years ago from today. And we believe we have become more enlightened. And so there are movements against capital punishment, not so much back then, but certainly more so today. And Stephen Bright provides 5 reasons that we should abolish the death penalty. It's in the case of the US, it's part of America's very racist past. The fact that most individuals that were put on death row tend to be either poor or people of color or those that really were marginalized in one way or the other. So that's part of its racist past. It has often sentenced innocent people to death. We still hear today of people that have been in jail for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and were there as innocent individuals. Imagine if they'd been put to death. So Bright says, no, for those reasons, we need to, we're not saying let people go free, but maybe seriously consider if it's a life sentence, it's a life sentence with at least a chance of getting that person out if DNA evidence can exonerate him, for example. 3, it's no longer needed to protect society. We have better ways to do it. We have better laws. It's not a deterrent either for those without a conscience, because if you don't have a conscience, you're not going to fear that what you do may have some retribution. And finally, it has no place in decent society. We like to think that we are enlightened and that we are individuals that can see beyond simply, this kind of savagery that used to be associated with capital punishment. And I probably mentioned in the slides, but even today in the US, where there is still capital punishment, the punishment itself is really benign. I mean, fatal injection, for example, we're trying to make it as nice as possible as we are still putting people to death. So there's something fundamentally not going wrong, but going on within the notion of capital punishment. We don't like to admit that we're putting people to death. We're trying to make it as nice as possible, as painless as possible, but we are still taking a life. Now, there are those still in favor of capital punishment. Lois Pojman believes that it gives killers what they deserve, it deters potential killers, and there's a kind of a biblical traditional view that's inherent in being on the side of capital punishment. And the way that Pojman looks at it, it looks backwards to the fact that the murderer or somebody who has committed a capital offense forfeits their right to life, and they deserve to die because of what they've done. So it looks back to what they have done by way of example, by way of behavior, but it also looks forward to the idea that the punishment should be or ought to be a deterrent for others. And this is, again, when someone does not have a conscience, the punishment is not going to be a deterrent because they're not thinking that way. So both arguments have some issues, but generally speaking, arguments for or against capital punishment really orient themselves around these particular ideas, that it's either part of the racist past, it's not part of decent society, those against it, but those for it say no. There's a kind of biblical notion of retribution, which again, is not considered or talked about in those terms. It's usually about justice. And justice, if you can imagine, the redressing of a balance, right? A life has been taken, so another life needs to be taken in order to redress the balance, right? That upheaval. So we need to remember that the moral justification for punishment is not vengeance, but it's retribution. Excuse me. So retribution is, again, is the redressing of the balance within that society, the upsetting within that society of a life being lost. So as much as we, wish to go for vengeance, We are more civilized, so we talk about it as retribution, justice being served. And those are, again, they're metaphors, but we're still doing the same thing. So in the second week, or the next set of modules, we looked at Locke's social contract, much more conciliatory, benign view of human beings, that we live naturally in a state of perfect freedom, and that mankind is equal and independent in that state of nature. And any of the offenses that are committed in that state of nature, we still believe that they can be, they should be followed by punishment. But it's not until we get into that social contract, or at least in that position, that we can do something about it. So Locke believes that we're all generally pretty happy. Rousseau did as well. And there are benefits, right? There are good aspects of the state of nature that need to be imported into the social contract. And in that way, we can protect that which is good in the state of nature, freedom, maybe not absolute freedom, but freedom to move about, have our being, be happy, pursue whatever activities we deem to be fulfilling to us, without, of course, breaking the law. But the only way in which the law can be sort of enacted is if we come together in that social contract. Now, Rousseau, writing about 50 to 60 years later after Locke, kind of follows through with some of the ideas, with some very important qualifiers. One of them is this notion that force does not give a government moral authority. Just because they've got bigger guns and tanks and water tanks and so on, does not give them the moral authority to either crush dissent or protest or demonstrations. I mean, a revolution may be one thing, but peaceful protest should not be met with water cannons. And Rousseau says, no, that force that the government uses against us is immoral, because we should be allowed, if we enter into a social contract and the contract is about freedom, then how dare a government take away that freedom? So civil authority, which is that kind of glue that holds us all together, arises out of the social contract, the way that Rousseau sees it. And individuals, again, like Locke, said that we lived in a state of nature, complete freedom, not subject to absolute authority of one sort or another. But living in that state of nature, however beautiful it was, made it more and more difficult, because we had to be able to find a way to resolve our differences if it came to the possibility of what would later become a law, right? We have a degree of freedom, but we want to make sure that we can protect that freedom in some way. So we enter into a contract with a sovereign, and again, this is a sovereign that can be overthrown through the voting process. We can overthrow them because there's a degree of arbitrariness in authority or sovereign that is fickle or subjective. Any kind of arbitrariness, including the use of force, is always frowned upon by Rousseau. Now, finally, we looked at Mill's social contract, and again, an extension of Locke and Rousseau, more democratic, more liberal, more emphasis on the individual. And he argues again, no government or individual may restrict their liberty unless the restriction can be justified on utilitarian grounds of promoting the well-being of the greatest numbers. The only way the government can step in is if someone is behaving in such a way that it's threatening enough people that it is not looked at in terms of a utilitarian perspective. It's not about the greater good. It's about individuals behaving in a certain way that is dangerous, that is threatening to others. And so Mill's idea of liberty is we can do whatever we like to do as long as it does not unjustly harm others. We are our own sovereigns, but we now can be, curtailed in our activity by the government, by society, if it starts to harm other people. Now, there's three appropriate regions of human liberty that Mill talks about, and this is still very important today. The first one, thought and feelings, to be able to express our thoughts and feelings openly and freely. Liberty of taste and pursuit. If we wish to be nonconformist and we like to dress or act or speak in a certain way, providing it doesn't hurt other people, we should be allowed to. And the third is freedom of assembly, to be able to come together with other people, like-minded individuals, in order to discuss ways to make society better. And so freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of taste and pursuits and feelings, all of those are good for a society. That indicates that the society is healthy. It's not a fascist society. It's not totalitarian, that it controls everything. So freedom of speech really needs to reinforce a notion that society is acting correctly on our behalf, and we can speak out if something is going wrong. So from there, we also talked about ethics of care. We talked about Lawrence Kohlberg and his 6 stages of moral development. And there's 6 of them, but the one that really matters in terms of the way we were looking at it is the third one: cultivates relationships and performs duties and social roles. We were talking about Kohlberg in terms of little Amy allegedly stopping there in her moral development, and that is clearly not the case. What Kohlberg was not doing was looking at how Amy was looking at or examining and thinking about moral dilemmas. And so of the 6, the one that matters is number 3, cultivating relationships and performing duties and social roles, that both Jake and Amy can do both. But for some reason, Kohlberg thought that little Amy stopped at that particular point. So what Kohlberg did is he came up with this rather difficult dilemma that Heinz was facing. And if you remember, it was this idea that Heinz has a wife who is dying. He goes to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist says, yes, I've got the medication, but it costs $1,000. And Heinz goes, look, I can't afford it. Can I pay, some of it or part of it? And the doctor said, or the pharmacist says, no. So Jake and Amy look at this dilemma, and Jake says, okay, well, that can be resolved through impersonal relationships, which means that Heinz should simply steal the drugs. Amy says, no, these people still, need to come to some kind of agreement. So she looks at the personal relationships between each person to see if there's something that can be, successfully achieved by which Heinz could still get the drugs and the pharmacist could still get paid. So Jake is kind of action-oriented, and Amy is kind of personality-oriented. And so for Kohlberg, using this, this thing called Heinz's dilemma, thought that Amy only had advanced to level 3 when Jake went beyond it. And the reason why that looks the way it does, because Kohlberg was simply not reading the information correctly. Carol Gilligan said, no, the 2 children think very differently. Amy's way is simply different. It's not inferior, it's just different. And Jake's responses are looked at as somehow at a higher level because there's not the sort of the interest in the personal relationships. It's goal-oriented. And somehow the moral orientation that we should instead be thinking about is not the one about goals, but one about caring, interpersonal relationships, taking care of others in personal ways. So Carol Gilligan's view is that, yes, men and women think differently. One is not necessarily better than the other, but certainly one can go much further if we think of the personal relationships involved in a dilemma to see if we can come up with something that is equitable for everybody. We also talked about the ethics of virtue, Aristotle. Aristotle's notion that the good of man or good of individuals is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtues such as courage, generosity, or self-control. Now, that commendable trait, right, that virtue, whatever it may be, is manifested again in habitual action. It isn't periodically or, when you feel like it, you could be courageous or generous. You do it all the time. It is simply something you do habitually. And that is the really important idea for Aristotle. He identifies as virtues, again, courage, generosity, temperance is another, but it's a midpoint between an excess and a deficiency. So in the case of courage, an excess would be stupidity and foolhardiness, not thinking through something, and a deficiency would be just cowardice, not doing anything, not being courageous at all. So Aristotle says these virtues are not only socially useful, they make an individual a good person, a socially useful person, and the virtue sits halfway between that that excess and a deficiency. So virtues such as loyalty, fairness, honesty are all necessary, right? They're necessary for people to interact with one another to some degree of success. And they're all qualities that are necessary for successful living, and also qualities that are necessary for a society to continue functioning. We talked about animal rights as well. Peter Singer, who is in favor of animal rights, and he compares it, first of all, to gender equality, then racial equality, then finally intellectual equality. And he says, if we are not willing to extend equality based on gender to women, or to racial to people of color, or what used to be known as visible minorities, or even to those that are mentally deficient in some way in intellectual equality, then we are not willing to extend it to animals. And he says, so for those reasons, we have made the headway, right? We have equality with gender, race, and intellect. So why not? Why not extend it to animals? Because for all the reasons that he presents in the slides, he says, if we don't, then we're guilty of speciesism, right? And that's when we favor a member of our own species over against others. So we favor us versus animals. We use animals, we abuse animals, we harness animals, we test products on animals, we kill them and eat them, and so on. So Singer's saying, if we don't put some thought into it, our behavior as it presently is we are guilty of speciesism, and that's what he means. And so he makes an argument based on the equalities that we presently have in society to argue in favor of animal rights. Now, Tibor Machan argues against animal rights, but he also does argue in favor of animal welfare. And he says, okay, it's pretty straightforward here. When we talk about rights, we're talking about a kind of moral goodness that animals are incapable of doing. Because when we talk about morality and rights, we're talking about liberty, we're talking about the ability to reason, and animals don't do that. Animal rights, or the idea of animal rights, is flawed because only human beings can rise to the level of these concepts. If you think back to moral development with Kohlberg, right, the 6 levels, animals really don't even start at number 1. They're friendly, sure. And if we have pets, we love our pets and they appear to love us back. They certainly love it when we're around, but they don't understand the concepts of rights and liberties and freedoms. So there's really no valid intellectual place for the rights of animals in a non-human world. But, and this is the important qualifier, in terms of animal welfare, we are the ones that make the decision. And the decision is, how are we going to treat animals? Therein lies the difference between animal rights and animal welfare. Animal rights for Singer is those are extended to animals. For Machan, he says, no, they only go as far as us, but we still have a moral obligation to animals to treat them right. So both thinkers start from different viewpoints or different moral positions, but really kind of meet in the middle. And so both are about treating animals with more kindness, but one talks about animal rights, which is Singer, and the other animal welfare, which is Tibor Machan. Then we visited Nietzsche and his pretty wacky idea of the master morality and slave morality. Master morality is the morality of the proud, the self-creating, the person that can sort of create their own destiny. And he compares that with slave morality, which is the morality of the groveling, the weak, the ineffectual, the group of people that seem to always blame others for their lack of behavior and their inability to make ends meet. So the ruling groups feel contempt for the slaves. And again, these are trigger words, master and slave. They're only ideas of people in charge of their own lives or not, right? That's as far as we want to go. So mass morality, the morality of the proud, the noble, the person who experiences themselves as determining values. And these ideas, at least the ability to create values, really is what sets the master aside or apart from the slave. The slave is now the recipient of the values that are created by someone else. So the master is proud of the fact that they are not made for pity. They are sort of fundamentally against the idea of being selfless. They are in fact selfish. Slave morality, again, for Nietzsche, is a morality of the violated, the oppressed, the suffering, the unfree, those who don't have a way to sort of wriggle out of the inferior position that they find themselves in. But the strange thing is, the slave morality is also the motor of society. As the slaves, again, these trigger words, for Nietzsche, these are the people that then create society to make a better, make a better life for themselves. So the pessimistic suspicion about the whole culture of humanity, this is Nietzsche's personal viewpoint. And he says slave morality is also essentially a morality of utility, right? The easy way out, blame other people. But within his writing is still this notion that the slave ultimately is the one that creates the society, because they are trying to create a better world that they either inherited or they see in the immediate future. And that in itself is what creates culture and civilizations. So no matter how you look at it, Nietzsche does say that there are people who can consider themselves masters because they are in control. But is the slave not trying to do the same thing, right? Ultimately, the slave wishes to be another kind of master. And as long as if you can self-define your life, right, your future, your goals, then you are a kind of master right off the bat. Okay, then the same week we looked at anarchy, which is, again, another very different way of looking at the social contract. Nietzsche is certainly one, but the other one is the notion of anarchy. And anarchy comes up in the social contract in different ways. Hobbes and Locke look at anarchy as the original state of nature. They look at it as essentially the same thing. And what are they looking at? They're looking at absolute liberty. Hobbes and Locke also think that anarchy is akin to having no government at all, which is exactly what it is. But they look at that as a bad thing. Now, Hobbes in particular thinks that anarchy, democracy are different interpretations of the same type or the same form of government. Some individuals are simply hostile to the notion of being governed, stepping into the social contract. So they hoped to be able to control their own destiny. And you can see why I put those two classes together, because the kinds of people that Hobbes is talking about are the kinds of masters that Nietzsche would go on to talk about 200 years later. And Locke, again, anarchy is no better than an arbitrary government, a petty government. There's no consistency. So anarchy is a response to inconsistency, arbitrariness, or a violent, volatile government. But the idea is already in the social contract. So today, there are two different types of anarchy or anarchistic thought. There's the older large A anarchism, which came out in roughly the early 1800s. Pierre Proudhon was one of the very first sort of anarchists. Bakunin was another. But that is sort of less popular than a newer small A anarchism. And that's a kind of direct action. If you remember the Occupy movement in 2011, that was a kind of small A anarchism. Black Lives Matter is a kind of small A anarchism. So it's direct action. And so direct action is about individual freedoms and liberty, any kind of self-organizing against the state, against some of the mandates of the state, any kind of illegal activity directed against state laws are all examples of small A anarchism. And that's pretty well what we have these days. The last 2 weeks, or last week, we looked at eugenics. Eugenics is the study of methods to improve the quality of the human race, especially by selective breeding. And we do this by trying to eliminate the negative, which would be fatal diseases, for example. But these days, with the knowledge that we have of eugenics and DNA, we can now also allegedly accentuate the positive. Particular skills, athletic skills, musical skills, or whatever, hair color, eye color, this kind of thing. But first of all, we have to decide who gets to state that, blue eyes or blonde hair are positive traits. What about green eyes or any other color eyes? So we need to be careful as to who makes those calls in terms of what is negative and what is positive. Genetic engineering, which is something that we have right now, we either have one of three options, a screening followed by an abortion if the fetus has got a fatal illness or an illness that may cause lifelong problems. There's also pre-implantation and genetic diagnosis, which is again a kind of eugenics, or finally gene therapy. And all of these fall under the sort of umbrella of either medical or cosmetic. And therein lies the main issue. If it's medical, it's typically trying to eliminate the negative traits, right? Fatal diseases. But the cosmetic one is the one that's a little bit more fickle because it has to do with accentuating the positive traits, if we can even identify those in the first place. But when we talk about eugenics, we need to remember that its legacy is complicated and at times extremely dangerous. In the early 20th century, eugenics was a political entity because governments and boards would dictate what they consider to be positive and negative. And we talked about how Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, eugenics was taken to the point where there were very few people that were not considered under the kind of negative microscope, and decided, the government decided at this point, well, we can, imprison them, we can sterilize them, or hey, why stop there? Why not just eliminate them altogether? These days, eugenics is looked at as kind of a private matter, that private individuals decide with their doctor whether they want to go into gene therapy or screening, genetic diagnosis. It's not public policy anymore. It's not something that governments can mandate or are mandating anymore. So that's the main difference. It used to be public policy to do these things, and whether it's Nazi Germany or Canada or the US, but today it is considered a private matter between a doctor and a patient. So the main issues with eugenics is deciding what constitutes a physical defect or disability. We know that there are in the past, or have been in the past, nightmare scenarios, Nazi Germany and Alberta in the 1920s and 30s. And genetic engineering is, at its worst, trying to drive out diversity. The way that people look very, very different skills and skill sets and abilities and so on. If we go full into genetic engineering, all those differences, right, the diversity that we experience in the world will eventually start to be driven out in favor of that single ideal. The issue now, again, is who defines the ideal? Who defines what is positive? So we need to always remember that, because if genetic engineering is allowed to reign free without any moral reflection, we will eventually create an underclass of people who can't afford the procedure. Because let's face it, the rich are already starting ahead of time or ahead of us, no matter what. So will we allow them to get a genetic head start on the poor and those that have no access to these particular types of strategies? So genetic engineering is there, but again, who gets access to it? Who gets to decide what is positive, what is negative? Who gets to decide what is ideal? Those are the things that really matter. In the last class, the modules from last week, we talked about terrorism and state-sponsored torture, and we wanted to just again define our terms. Terrorist killings to condemn the means rather than the ideological ends. So terrorism uses, well, in fact, deals almost exclusively with collateral damage, right? Which is something that used to happen during warfare, where if we accidentally killed civilians, that would be considered collateral damage. Terrorists deal exclusively with collateral damage by blowing up buildings, whether it's setting off a bomb in a supermarket or shopping mall or school. That is the main difference between warfare, as it has been known in the past, with collateral damage, and terror attacks that deal exclusively with collateral damage. Because we have thought in the past that we try to minimize civilian casualties. And of course, it is an idea only, because as we've seen in the war in Ukraine, hospitals and apartment buildings and any sort of civilian complex has been targeted. So there's a lot of muddiness between this idea of what is typically done during warfare and what constitutes a terrorist act. So if we are able to get hold of a terror suspect, since 2001, in North America at least, we have now had to grapple with this idea that state-sponsored torture is something that we allegedly agree to. Now, what is that? We are trying to look at the use of torture in order to extract information. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, the torture, first of all, isolates the victim, overwhelms the victim with pain and suffering, or at least the threat of it. It terrorizes the victim through this real or implied panic, and finally breaks that person physically and mentally. And somehow the material we extract from that person after the fact is considered valuable information. And the only rationale for behaving this way is not the backwards-looking notion of Louis Podgman saying, well, they got what they deserve. Well, first of all, we don't know whether we even have the right person. So it's not really looking forward, or looking backwards to what they have done, because we don't know for sure. It's only looking forward to intelligence gathering. And again, the intelligence that we managed to gather could be incorrect. It's been obviously corroborated under extreme pressure. And let's face it, most of us would start babbling and saying anything just to make it stop. So if you end up with a sort of terror culture or torture culture that we were living in for several years following 2001, to torture someone becomes some kind of heroic act. The motivation behind torture becomes rationalized, right? It becomes something that we need to do. Torture itself becomes dissociated with the cruelty. We focus more on intelligence gathering, enhanced interrogation is what it's called. And finally, the focus has shifted from the victim to the torturer as somehow some kind of hero. So as we sort of slide away from the victim towards the torturer / hero, we forget less and less about the pain that's being inflicted and the validity of the intelligence that's being gathered. One of the ways in which libertarians and those that are in favor, well, libertarians want small government. Maybe we just should talk about people that are in favor of it. Doesn't have to be libertarians, could be anyone. The notion of the ticking bomb, right? The ticking bomb scenario, that's the way in which we can undermine this otherwise enlightened liberal position against the use of torture. Because the idea is that, this bomb could go off at any moment. We have some suspects. We have the right to interrogate them, quote unquote, to get that information. Well, the idea behind that is a very slippery slope, because we don't look at the harmful practices or even the legal aspect of harming someone just because we have them in our possession. We don't know. We don't know if we have got the right person. What if we accidentally kill that person? Who's responsible? Is there any responsibility at all? And if we continue doing this and excusing ourselves, we will end up in what's called a torture culture. Because if we do, then the norm shifts towards violence as a solution to everything. We come to tolerate and accept violence as some kind of normal response, and that in itself becomes extremely dangerous. Okay, so that's basically the entire, the second half of the term. If you have any questions or you want some clarification before you start the test, shoot me a quick email. I'm not sure how long this has lasted. I'm going to say maybe half an hour or so. But again, the test is only in 2 parts: identify and explain in the first half, worth 10 marks, and the second half, short answer questions, worth 15 marks. So the whole thing is really only worth 25 marks. So don't panic, don't overthink it. Just as you are going through this video, or have already gone through because it's at the end, just take a quick look at your notes. All the ideas that are discussed in the test, all the content is pretty straightforward. It's mostly general knowledge. Anyway, best of luck with that. We will see each other soon, and we will talk very soon as well. Take care then. Bye-bye.